friend here. Greetings and thank you for stepping back in time with me. I am Julie Bachand. I am fourth generation Bachand. I'm the great granddaughter of Michael Bachand. And looking back into the genealogy, there has been a Julie every century, and I'm the Julie of the 19th century. I'm going to go into our name a little bit here. The proper way to say our name is Bachand for the blue, and it basically means green. Bachand, the B-A-C-H or back of it, is a term of balsamic meaning small river, an aqueous place named surnamed by the transmission of her inhabitants, those that live close to the brook. And that statement will kind of make sense when I show you where they settled in Canada. Bachand is actually a province located in northern France, a few kilometers from the Belgian border. And I believe that is probably where we came from, out of France. Next. These are some of the people that we started on our genealogy tour. A lot of the pictures I have came from Agnes and Lena's photo albums, assorted cousins. It was more than just these people, but we are actually standing. Jimmy at the time lived in Lena's house, and we are actually standing in Lena's house at this point. Coats of arms. There was a while there for everybody had a coat of arms, but I did do some studying on this, and Yvonne did also. I'll tell you in another slide here, but note the club on the coat of arms. Next. That is my grandpa's brand. Continues to be in the family. The hand-forged brand of my father's club was told to me by my brother Kenny. Art Duff hand-forged it for my dad. Kenny stated that where Tom Monahan's photo shop is, now in 2007, where was the little shop? The entrance shop was its name. Kenny sold minnows for 25 cents a dozen. Kenny forgot some of them in a bucket in the porch that had been covered up, and Mom found them by the sink in the porch. And I can imagine that was one of many things that Kenny got in trouble for. And I think I was still getting in trouble for that 21 years later. But I do have that brand with me today. This is just a little of the Bachand history. All the Bachands in Canada are definitely interrelated. The name and the original ancestor who came from France was Nicholas. He was born in St. Cloud near Paris, France. His father, Nicholas I, was born in Bachand, France. That town still exists and is where the Bachand name originated. Nicholas II was a French soldier that landed on the Isle of St. Marguerite in the St. Lawrence River between Montreal and Bouquerville, Quebec, in about 1687 with the Army detachment. He settled in Bouquerville, married Anne Lemericks. He was 25 and she was 14. And this is something that carried on the Bachands forever. The guys waited forever and then got a nice young bride. But most of the women outlived them. All the Bachands are descendant of this couple. The Bachands were a pioneer family of the town of Bouquerville. Quebec had the tricentennial celebration of the town in 1967. A monument was erected in front of the Civic Center, which has Bachand on it. And I have a picture of that to show you a little later. There's also a street in town by the name of Bachand. It is the street in front of the Sherbrooke University. The Bachand name has at different times, even today, had variations such as Bachand, Bachant, Backham, Backchaps, Furtive Blue, and Greenleaf. The Bachamps. I actually was contacted by a gentleman out in Connecticut when I was doing all this stuff, and he said he was related, and I believe him. It is estimated they're alive today. Now this is old, between 3,000 to 4,000 Bachands and 1,000 families. There are 4 different Bachands in the family tree history of Jacqueline Kennedy, the late President of John F. Kennedy, her claim to fame. There's a Bachand buried in Arlington Cemetery at Washington, D.C., a short distance from President Kennedy's grave in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And this was all compiled by genealogist Albert Bachand in Massachusetts, and there is his contact. And like I said, this is information from a very long time ago. James's side actually had most of this information. I got this from Jeannie. And so, next. Here's the map. When you look at some of the, where they were born or died or whatever, it'll say Bookerville. But these islands in the middle here were actually where they settled. For one, they had protection. I gotta take my readers off the monitor, I can't stand. Look, you guys. They had protection from the Indians, so they were on a moat. So their actual settlements were on those islands. And when you went up there, some of those still remain in families. It's one of the very few places where private property is still owned, is in those river islands. And that kind of makes sense with the name. We must, as a family, always enjoy water because we were by the brook. That's where our names came from. But you can kind of see those islands and then Bookerville right next to it. And I might be saying that wrong, but that's how I pronounce it. But they were on the islands for protection. Like I said, they were soldiers. They came up here and basically made Canada for France. So that's kind of where they came from. That's a newer picture. Of course, it's very busy, but I did research a few of them up there in Canada. They were still farmers, shoemakers, in construction, things like that. Other than that, next. This is the plaque that was just talked about on that deal, or the second one where pioneers up there. Any of you that are a descendant of James Mike, you are eligible to be a part of the Black Hills Pioneers, and there's my certificate. It is a good organization. They do a lot of stuff for history. When we get into some of the pictures of the Bismarck Trail, you'll see some of the work that the Black Hills Pioneers did as far as marking the trail. They've done a lot of work with cemeteries, helping restore some of the old headstones and fences and whatnot. Okay, now we're coming down out of Canada. This is the Bismarck Trail line. This is a very early map. It has the old counties on it, okay? So you're not gonna notice Butte is probably the most. Harding was a lot shorter. Perkins is 4 of them. Reservation lines in there. This one over here is actually North Dakota. And you can see all the railroads and the forts and whatnot, and the start of the trail from Bismarck. The Bismarck, over here, they did have railroads already by the time our forefathers came and they could ride the rails to Bismarck. But there's some interesting pictures. I'm going to go into a little bit about that. The Bismarck Trail, Ben Ash, S.C. Dodge, and Stimmy Simpson, Ed Donahue, Rose Marsh, all established the trail in December of 1875. Custer had already come down in 1874 and pretty much said, yeah, we got to get people down here. I think there was people coming already. Like I said, James in the 1910 census, he was already showing that he came to this country in 1865. So he was either already working in North Dakota, and I went up there one time so far, did a little research trying to find if they were up in that area. I've tried to research the freight lines, and there was not a lot of records kept on those. So I might be at the end of the trail there. But Miller and McPherson with 23 wagons arrived October 76. John Pennell with 75 teams. George People with 27 teams. The Northwestern Express Stage and Transport Company, which was the main freighters and shippers, they had 25 drivers, 8 messengers, 300 wagons, 28 coaches, 175 horses. On the freighting side, they had 250 teamsters, 600 mules and horses, 348 oxen, and freighters were hired out in the winter when they came down to cut timber in the hills so that they could stay employed with the freighting company, which I thought was a very neat deal. April 11th, 1877 is another one that comes to mind, and they had 68 passengers on that trip, a one-way fare of $23. It was 240 miles and it took nearly 40 hours. By May 3rd, there were stages running weekly, and in 1880 it kind of ended because the railway reached pier. There was nicknames for everybody, it seems, and when you read in some of the old books, I kept seeing this deal about messengers. I was thinking the mail route. That's not true. A messenger was the guy that ran the shotgun off the stage. He was the messenger. So when you get into an old book, say even the 20s and 30s, when they're talking about the messengers, they're talking about the gunpowder behind somebody. But they ran, what I read in the Bismarck Trail, at least one guy, one messenger all the time. The robbers are called the Knights of the Road, which I found was funny. The trail stayed intact for years even after they quit using it because there was enough settlers, they still used it. And when you get up into my country, you don't cross creeks at every spot, or you'll stay there. So they still had to use the rock crossings and things that they'd instituted to actually get down here. The drivers were often called whips, and like I said, the guards were called shotgun messengers. A lot of times they're just said by messengers. What thing can you notice about that picture about the stage? You see the white horses in the back? Mm-hmm. Different stage lines ran the same route. And in order for the gentleman that was at the stage stop to get the right horses ready, he needed to know what company was coming down the line. And he would take his one-eyed eyepiece and look at the dust bowl coming down the trail. He'd see them 2 white horses. He would know that that's Northwestern's stage line. And he would go get their horses, their team, everything set up for them. So when they got to the stage stop, it was an easy fix. And it's not mentioned much, but if you get to looking at a lot of the old pictures, there was a white horse somewhere in the lineup, or a light colored, whether it's Palomino, buckskin, it doesn't matter. But there was a light colored horse, usually in the lineup, to help the guys change horses. It happened it depended on the rough terrain in the hills. Sometimes they changed horses within as much as 8 miles. Out on the prairie, it would depend, 12, 15, somewhere right in there, they changed. A lot of them out on the gumbo, the stage station was where they had water. This was not a romantic way to drive or arrive. It was dusty, dirty, rough. Inside was the expensive seats. These guys back here, They didn't pay very much, but they also may not have made it either. I have a road back there, even on a smooth street, and it's hard to sit there. Most stage lines in the movies, they're galloping. They long trot it most of the time. The other thing I can say about the stages is the night drivers, their front team usually was a lighter colored team. And that was because in the dark, he could kind of see what that team was doing. They were also exceptionally broke. They might be the only horses in the whole setup that was broke. I know when we did the Medora, we reenacted the Deadwood to Medora line. They talked about that, and they had a fancy team to bring them into Deadwood and a fancy team to bring them into Medora. But in between was broncs, literally. They went out onto the prairie, ran a bunch of horses in, and they just hooked them up and went. So it may have been a very exciting ride. But eventually they probably got tired. But I do know that the night drivers, and it was the same from what I've read, the same guys ran the same routes. They knew their roads, they knew where the bog holes were. If they had a bad creek crossing, how to take it on. Those guys all drove the same. One of them I read, he drove 75 miles a day for 3 years. They were tough, and they had hands that were this big. And there's some of the Bachans, Mark being one of them, that had very big hands. My dad talked about his grandpa, and I'll show you the picture too of how big his hands were from working with their hands, basically. That's about it. Rainstorms, anything like that, it stopped. This is a Concord stage. If you ever get a chance to go to Deadwood, they have 2 stages. The one Mike Bachand, our family's notoriously known for, pulls. That is the big Concord stage. The actual one in the museum actually has a bullet hole in it. They do not allow that one out in the museum anymore due to its worth. But Hanson's did make a replica and it's pulled out. And then we usually pull the little Deadwood stage, which is mud wagon or mud stage. And that would be actually more what you'd see going to Bismarck, I think. Yeah. This is the mud stage. You can see it's shorter. They were sloped a little bit different. They were made to go, they were the mud bogey. And if you've been between here and Bismarck, Gumbo is the name. Especially north of New Ulm, up in there. I don't know how realistic this was with mule picture. I do have this one up here, and the caption I got is it was the Deadwood stage. I'm not going to say it wasn't because mules were stronger. They could go longer, less feed, less water. But they also can have attitude in it, especially people who drive them. But that's just a little history. Nice. This is Perkins County and my faithful companion Izzy. This is the Black Hills Pioneers. They have marked the Bismarck Trail next to roads going up through there. Both these bottom ones are just north of the Morrill River, but they're really cool to see. And I don't know if you can use your imagination a little bit, but see the different weave in the grass right there? That is the trail. And there are spots in Perkins County where they have not plowed. When it's dry or early in the spring, you can see the trail. We reenacted it on wagon trains and it just gives you goosebumps. Okay, now we're getting into the horses and things like that. This is Lena's riding club card. She was a member of the riding club. There used to be a barn over here on First Western Bank Steel when I was a small kid. I'm sure Lena might have kept the horse over there. Her house is that way, not very far, so makes sense that she kept the horse out there. Lena was one of the spinster daughters. I'll go into her a little later, but she did a lot of stuff. So she's pretty active. But that was just cool when we found that. I thought it was really neat. Here's Frank with some of his workhorses that look to be Belgians. I assume that's what they were. They kind of look that way. Another name that we hear around there is McPherson's out on Alkali Creek, and they had gray Percherons. So there was a lot of pride in horses. Good teams, good saddle horses, and then the broncs. A lot of the mentioning when they first came, when you read some of these old stories, is they plowed with an ox and a horse to break ground, and some of them it was by ox teams. The oxen were stronger, and they took less water and feed than a horse or a mule. I'm going to go into that in just a little more detail, but horses were always a mainstay in the Bachands. There were several racetracks back in the day, Belfouche, Deadwood, Sturgis, Rapid City, Nisland. Everybody always had a horse race. County fairs, who had the fastest horse? Game on, money down. And they dragged Main Street. Instead of cars, they raced their horses. The other thing that was very vivid in the time they were here was the cavalry. The cavalry here at Fort Meade, they got thoroughbred studs or high quality studs, and they would lease them or pan them out to area farmers, and they would breed their mares to those studs, and then the cavalry got remount animals back. The demise of the draft horse kind of came with world wars. They sent them overseas. The steam engines came in like 1917. 1920, and as the engines came in, the draft horses went away. One of the big draft horse raisers in Perkins County were the Storms, and I think it was 250 head they rounded up and actually took over the Tooks in Wyoming, and they are now the ancestors of the Took bucking horses. So, days of 76, can't miss that. We were in it quite a bit. Frank was there. We've been in that parade for 102 years now. Alkali Threshing Bee. There was lots of clubs. Riding clubs. There was polo. They did a lot of stuff with their horses. This is, they call them Murphy wagons. And the wagon behind them is a sheep wagon. And the sheep wagon was your house on wheels. But in this picture, they have went and they've harvested hay. 3 loads of hay in the sheep wagon, and they probably went for months, but in some of the stories, they went to Deer's Ears, which is a hill monument, I guess north of, on the Morrow River, and they hayed a lot. I think personally, probably the Bachands knew that Deadwood needed hay. The cavalry needed hay, and it was $25 a load if they sold it. So once they had gotten whatever they needed for their farmstead, I could see them going. Jenny Bachand married Bob Packer, and they were kind of up in that area, so they had family there. So maybe the mower, the rake, if they used one, wasn't that far away. All they needed to bring was the wagons, the teams, and themselves. But they would go out for a long time and stay in the sheep wagon. You can see the teams, and then the wagons, and then that was probably a saddle horse right there at the inn, or a spare horse. It's hard to say. But the nostalgia of having your team match, you can see the different colors in there. The other area that they went to is kind of more up by us, and it's called the Big Meadows. Up in Perkins County, they have what's called lake beds. And in those areas, there is a natural water area, and I'm sure the grass to them and there back in that time was huge. and they could cut it and it would probably regrow. But there was quite a few stage stations between here and there where they could sold that hay. Some of the later stuff as far as haying was the introduction of alfalfa. And Fostoria is one of the very first ones. And if you can remember, it's the yellow alfalfa. And the bees really loved it. This is Sturgis. This is an ox team. This is what James drove. He was a freighter. That's a freight wagon. They did hook them up in line like that. Usually the last one was called a pup, and it was just a two-wheel. The oxen trains were anywhere from a dozen to 20 to whatever they thought they needed to get here. Again, probably just the first team knew what they were doing. But once they got them captured, not always did they unhook them, they just let them lay down and they tried to feed them like that if they were wild or unbroke. Freight wagons do not have brakes. So if they had to go down much of a hill, it was an adventure because what ran through the oxen was a big chain. And that's how they pulled off their yokes. So in order to brake his wagons, he had to run the brakes on the wagons, put skid locks on them, whatever. A lot of times what the stage line ran may necessarily be what the freighters ran, just because of that reason. Like I said, they were called bull whackers. They usually walked the entire way. I think a freighter took close to 9 days to 2 weeks to get down here from Bismarck because usually they were grossly overloaded. But some of the stories you hear about with bull whackers is they might have had some fluent French words that were explicit. Especially when they started going up the canyon to Deadwood because it was a one-way trail. And the big thing was the more they swore and cuss at them to get them going, the louder it would ricochet up the canyon so everybody knew where everybody was. But that's just a little tidbit. That tall building right there, even though you can't see it now, is actually a Keffler store on Sturgis. Oxen run like horses. When the front team, like I said, was probably the broke team. They run off of G and Ha and whoa. Some of the stories I've heard about the oxen like plowing, if they got tired, they just lay down, and some of them were really good about slipping their yokes off, and then they go lay in the creek, and then you had to get them out of there eventually. I just watched a deal on Facebook, and I think they pulled 17,000 pounds, two of them. True oxen were huge, but our forefathers hooked up a lot of longhorns and took off with them. They sawed their horns off to the point they couldn't get stuck, and off they went. The other thing about bull whackers, a lot of women that lost their men, you didn't have a lot of options if you couldn't find another husband. In order to make way or take care of your children, you had to turn to prostitution or laundry or cooking or something on that order. A lot of women took on bull whacking. There's some famous ones. Gray Bull has a picture of one lady. I didn't write her name down, but that's her. She was kind of special. The guys loaded her freight wagons in the start and unloaded her at the end. And I think she ran the pier to Deadwood Trail more. These are stone Johnnies. There's still a few prominent up in our area. They were put on high points among the hills so you could see them. Most of them are pretty vigilant. They allowed visions of, if they went up there, they could see the surrounding area. They marked territories before fences were put in. Sometimes they marked water or springs. A lot of times they were used to drop a person's mail or provisions for the sheep herders in wagons. They would go to their stone Johnny and drop off their supplies or drop off their mail. Kalena's grandfather tells a story of his dad, who was a small child and sat and watched herd at the stone Johnny. And if he didn't get back and get the sheep gathered up before late afternoon, the coyotes would bring the sheep to him. And him and the dog and the sheep would run as fast as they could to the barn. And now this is a boy of about 10, so he's hustling. And if they didn't lock their dog in their house at night, they would literally chase him around the house trying to kill him all night. So that's just a little story from them. Another story, I took care of a veteran by the name of Tolsrud, and they were in the upper Hardin County, and him and his sister, he herded turkeys and geese. And his, they had a mean dog, and he said, I always sent the dog with her. And I had the lever action, and thank God I never had to shoot it, because I was too little and it would blow me into the ground. But they seen Indians. It wasn't that the Indians weren't around, or Native Americans, but he said we were never harassed or, things never went bad. When they brought their turkeys and geese back in, the turkeys were put in the barn first and they'd roost in the rafters, and then the geese sat in the bottom. And he said we had wolves, we had coyotes, but it was just interesting that the diversity of some of the stuff. But there are a few stone Johnnies still up in our area, and they're kind of neat to see. Okay, this is Sturgis. This is a 1902 Cowboys. Mary Keffler's brother, Frank, is in this picture. Somewhere in there. You notice the oxen standing in the back. Tom Bowen, they had oxen, they had them up at Deadwood. They had them down here and pulled with them, but there's a lot of names in there that people will notice, see. But that was gathered in the 1902 Cowboys in 1962. Okay, here's a very messy family chart, I guess, if somebody wants to look at it, but that's kind of the start of us. You can notice Bookerville up there in Quebec. But there we are. I'm going to start with Chrysostom, however you say his name correctly. That picture with the other bullwhackers in there. Here is the Keffler dry goods store. When I started going through some of the history of what people did, there were two Kefflers that had stores. Dominic had a feed store, and I don't know which one this is. And then I believe his name was Jacob, or Jake had another more of the dry goods store, so I'm thinking that's Jake's. But again, there's the freighters. Dogs were very common. That's about it, I guess. That's a pretty early picture there. That's would be where the ball fields are back over that way, I think. One of the hotels. I'll get to that in another slide. Part of James's children worked in some of the hotels. They called it a different one, but just to give you an idea of some of the stuff they did. The legendary Fruth Hotel. Mary Keffler's sister, Anna. Well, I guess I got it there. Married Henry Fruth. I believe Martin and Brooks Slater bought this building. Down that way now, right? Over here. Up there?
Right down here.
I'm getting lost now. Main and 2nd Street.
Where the bank is down here.
Yeah. So, there's always a lot of history with the Fruth Hotel. Hang on here, I'll get back here. Peter Lorraine, there was a Fruth Saloon. I don't know if it was attached to that at one time, but Peter Lorraine, which the Lorraines are on my other side of the family, but he ran the whiskey, basically. He would go to the railroad, get it off the railroad, and then he distributed it through town and out to the fort. And at the time when I read that deal, there was 11 saloons in town that he could deliver his whiskey to. One-Eyed Jack's is down there now, but this was the independent oil company, Jack Bachand, down the corner. I remember it as this when it was the old Senex building. Here's some people having fun. Dolores Cheney, Alphonse Edgar, and Jenny Sly. Jenny worked at the Jason Cheney's for years. Alphonse was Gramani's brother. And Dolores has on Lena's mink coat for the picture. And I'm guessing they were going to a dance or something like that. In those days, you could not attend a dance as a lone woman. And boy, did I have fun talking to cousins about what my dad did. Because he thought he was a saint till I heard about later. Cousins, neighbors, didn't matter. If there was a dance, everybody was escorted. That doesn't mean it was your date for the night. It just meant that's who you went with and that's who you came back with. Some of the veterans I worked with, they had stories about that. One gentleman, there was 3 brothers and his neighbor had 7 girls. He said, we had a lot of fun. I said, I bet you did. But he told stories of taking the girls to dances, pie socials, the dancing itself. They were always escorted, and my dad did escort the cousins quite a bit here and there. In the background, I know it's kind of hard to see up there, but that's the Black House. We're going to talk about that. It stood where the Catholic Church is now. And there's a little story in here from one of the cousins. There it is. The residence of Dr. F.A. Brandt, who married the builder's widow, was at Howard and First Streets, where the present Catholic Church is located. It had 40 rooms, and though referred to as a hospital, the fact is disputed. In 1913, Miss Emma Israelson opened a millinery and dressmaking parlor there, and Monsieur Forbach was a boarder prior to the opening of the rectory in 1954.
That's Monsignor Forbach.
Okay.
He was a priest.
Her family gave me the info. Not gonna fight with her next. This was given to me by Marilyn Nona, which is Connie's sister. Cousin, sorry. When I was a young lass of 11 or 12, I was quite high-spirited, imaginative personality. My mother, Anne K. Bachand, was recruited by Father Leo Doherty to become a chief cook and pot washer for him in this abode. As I came across the recent picture of this old house in the Tribune, it conjured up memories of 50 years later. I was living a fantasy. I had often wondered the history of the house as I passed it when I went to visit my friend Mary Gorman, and who could have such a large family that they utilized all the rooms, not to mention the floors. Well, let me tell you, it was a fantasy. At first, according to my mother's directions, I was not to leave the kitchen quarters, but alas, being the curious personality that I was, and still am, and she was, I ventured into the realms and depths of the mansion. As I thought of it, my mother, who was the very best cook, I think we all could say that, don't we? On the face of the earth, was busy in the kitchen, which gave me freedom to roam at will. I soon discovered that there was not only one staircase leading to the upper floors, but 3. I was always fascinated about the top floor and somewhat hesitant to go up there, as I had recently seen a movie called The Centerville Ghosts and had visions of this house having its own ghost. But I finally ventured up. It was warm and musky up there. Parts of it were not complete, but oh, it was cozy. I visualized the original owners, Dr. Platt and his family. I don't know their history, but can you imagine growing up in a house this size? No intercoms, no phones. Could anyone know when it was time to eat, let alone other important events that were occurring in the house? I would imagine a place this large would have necessitated servants, but there certainly was ample room for maids, butlers, scullery women, boots, blacks, etc. At first I thought it was thought of it as a castle, then a mansion, because there were no garrets or towers to speak of. The only thing missing was window walks, similar to the houses of the northeastern area of America. There were so many rooms they were hard not to only remember, but to imagine they were used for. The entrance room, as I refer to it, as I don't know what else to call it, was quite large, with a sweeping staircase one would imagine seen only in the movies. On the ground level was also a formal dining room, a sitting room, a parochial library, possibly a solarium, several other rooms that I thought must be extra bedrooms, coffers, maids, butlers, etc. Strange, but I don't recall any bathrooms, although I'm sure there must have been some on this. It was about 1948. This house, after all, had been utilized to board the male students at St. Martin's Academy, and surely they would have had inboard plumbing. I remember very heavy brocade draperies and area rugs, not carpets, but exotic-looking rugs with fringes on the edges. There was a considerable amount of dark mahogany wood, and the door jambs were neatly carved, window frames, and I'm quite sure there was a number of fern-like plants about. I think my mother was also responsible for the cleaning and dusting, and I vaguely remember having to help her in those chores, which was very boring to me as I continued to desire more exploration in every nook and cranny. I envisioned myself as the daughter of this family, very wealthy, with numerous brothers and sisters, and each of us having our own personal maid and valet. I would go to the one bedroom to the next, to the second floor, deciding what room would be mine. Of course, I picked the most glamorous room with the view of the hill with the letter Sturgis and the white stones to the north. I envisioned making my grand entrance to my coming out party as I descended the front grand staircase. That coming out's a little different than it is now. To be greeted by the most handsome rich men in the township. There were many lilac bushes planted out front of the house, and their perfume scent permeated the entire place. Oh, but it was grand. The pictures not show it, but when Father O'Doherty occupied these quarters, there were a wrought iron fence around the entire yard. There's also a large kidney-shaped fish pond with goldfish. The backyard was huge with cement benches, arbors with vines covering them, and a garage as well as an old building for me to investigate. This is where my knight in shining armor would call upon me and lift me off my feet. We would ride into the sunset and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, my time was short-lived here. My mother was able to obtain work at Fort Meade, so our stay here was approximately 1 year. This was time for me and my sister Patsy was away. And on the back, it just says at school, and she kind of goes into stuff with her siblings. Oh, you got that. College, and my brother was away playing basketball. I also remember that every Friday night, my sister would come home from college in Rapid City, and I would meet her at the bus depot, which was at the filling station on the corner of Main and Junction, I think, where there is a sign about Big Red Star, perhaps a Texaco. And nearly every Friday night, without fail, my sister would bring me a caramel apple as a treat. How I look forward to that. I also recall that after Father was served his meal, we ate in the kitchen, did the dishes, tidied up the place, and then returned to our home about 7 p.m. Mother was worn out, but my imagination would sustain me until the next day we set forth on a new adventure. After we left, I was very sad to hear the entire building would be razed to make room for the new church, and my fantasy mansion would disappear, as well as the beautiful gardens. Father O'Doherty gave me the fish out of the fish pond, and we tried very hard to keep them alive, only to see them struggle and die in a small fish bowl we bought. Father said we needed more room than we were able to provide. I understood what section of the house was saved and is currently in Rockerville. I wonder about other people who have memories of this old house and what your impression might be. To this day, when I walk along sidewalks of current St. Francis Church and School, I again conjure up remembrance of that wonderful, large, mysterious structure where I was able to lose myself in the preteen years, not yet a woman, no longer a child. Dolores told me that Lena used to cook many of the meals that were served here. Lena did a lot of catering for different events and things like that. I
just want to say that she used every pot she had, and us kids would have to do the dishes afterwards.
Well, that's what you answer for. That's my priority too. I got a little sweet water here. This is great grandma and some of the kids. Given there is one person missing from this picture and they're fairly well dressed up, I think this is after my Grandpa Joe's funeral. You can see the 5 girls in the back and Ed and Albert in the front with Grandma. Teresa, Clara, Agnes, Lena, and Gertrude. And then, like I said, the boys in front.
Ted was Marilyn Bachand's dad, and Andrew was Martin,
Yeah.
his dad.
I'll go through them here in just a little bit, just some pictures. That's all right. That's all right. Trust me, I had a lot of difficulties even knowing who these people were. Okay, thanks. This is a very early shot. This is Mike Bachand, a very young Mary Keffler. She was married at 16 and had her first child at 16, and they lost it, the first one. It was also a boy. It is buried up in the cemetery. Let's see, this is Joseph here, my grandfather, Albert, and then he's holding Lena. But it's pretty early. This is all the kids, earlier picture. Well, no, I love his little hat. This would have been probably at the original homestead thing. Okay. This is Mike in later years. I'm going to take this moment just to talk about him a little. In that picture, you can see how big his hands were. My dad never wanted to shake his hand. He said that was just a bad idea. The other thing you'll notice is his pants are on that. Grandpa, my dad, talked about him always having stomach pains. Come down to Marilyn, Nona, and I. We have a little medical background. Click back one. One more. Notice Joseph's physique. He's very long-handed, big feet, longer facial features. Now back. When he got older, and I don't know if I have a photo of him in here or not, but those features are more prominent. And Marilyn had done a lot of research into, because he was a very sickly man, and he died when my dad was only 15. But we're kind of wondering if there isn't just a small genetic chance there is a little more fans in the family history. What that is Abe Lincoln had it too. Elongated features, long fingers, hands. There's some changes in the roof of the mouth. But the other thing that is prominent about it is aneurysms. I'm pretty sure that's what he had. It causes pain. My dad had one, I believe Martin had one, I think Oscar had one. So it kind of runs in the family, and usually it's right above the kidneys in the main vein. If they burst, it's a blowout, it's a balloon type action. And if they burst, you live about 3 minutes. but a lot of times they thought it was just a heart attack. But it's just something to, when you get into these older pictures, it's kind of like looking at them stage pictures. There's details that have meaning. Yeah, one story that my dad talked about, grandpa, great-grandpa there, I guess, but he had to have his plow on his walking plow fixed or sharpened or something, so he loaded it in a gun sack, threw it over his shoulder, and walked to Deadwood in a day. Took it to the blacksmith shop, had it repaired, fixed, sharpened, whatever, and walked back. So he was tough, because those things are not light. This is a pretty cool picture that I really like. It's Grandma Keffler or Grandma Bachand. Marie Lorraine, she married Joseph. She's my grandma. That's my dad sitting next to her, and his sister Camilla. And that is down on Bearview. That's down, they'd already moved. So, next. This is Joseph Bachand. He was the eldest son, and Grandma Lorraine, their wedding. Grandma Lorraine worked for the doctors, Napstis. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Napster. She was their nanny, and we have her little French dress, and I mean, she was a little woman, 4'6", 4'7", she was tiny. None of the Lorraines were very big. That's where we get our shortness from. She had been their nanny. When I researched her, actually, she also took care of, it was either her parents or the doctor's parents. She took care of the whole family. She was their servant in Deadwood. And Grandpa had gotten sick, and that's how he met her. I think it talks about that. He had to have some surgery done, an eye, ears, and nose specialist. And that's how he met her. They were older when they started a family. Albert, his brother, and Anne, her sister, stood up for him. So, this picture does have James and Mike all in it. I'm not going to be able to just pick everybody out. The Fruits are in there, and Kefflers. It was a big shindig. Duhamels came from Rapid City. There was some other notary people that came from Rapid City too. More pictures of them. This is my Grandpa Joe's first communion. Okay. This is, I should probably just start going through the families. Chrysophilum Bachand and Henrietta Delude started in Canada. So they're the ones in Bookerville. They had James, Mike, Azilda, Rose, Louisa, and Agnes. And there's one more child that's recorded, but I don't know where they went or if they even lived. James, Mike, and Archie all came down here. The rest of the family went to Massachusetts, Connecticut, in that area. James and Celestine Tatro had 11 kids. Mike and Mary Keffler had 10 kids. Azealia and Peter Malix, which I'll talk about, had 12 kids. The Malixes initially moved down with the original family into Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts area. Whatever reason, they didn't like it. So they came around and they went to Clyde, Kansas. And I'll get into that a little more. There are Bachands in Clyde, Kansas to this day. My nephew Dennis Bachand met the other Dennis Bachand when they had a little dispute over who had parts at John Deere. Dennis said when he walked up to the guy, it was me, 20 years older. So yes, there are Bachands there. Why they picked Clyde, Kansas, I can't answer that, but the Malixes had 12 kids, 6 of them came up here. I'll go into that just a little more. Rose DeLima, she married a Mallow, and they were in the New Hampshire area, and she lived to be close to 100 years old. She was the last surviving child of that bunch. And then there was 2 sisters that stayed in Canada, Louisa and Agnes. So then we get down to James and Celestine. James was an ox team freighter, a bull whacker on the Bismarck Trail. I did find him in the 1910 census. He said he came to this country in 1865. I talked to some of the cousins. They said he was here in 62. I'm not going to argue. It was a long time ago. He was a freighter for a number of trips down here. And freighting was not easy and not nice. The bullwhackers were known to pick up mites and lice from teams. And he had a wife and 5 kids. Was it 4 or 5? In Canada. And I'm sure Mrs. Celestine said, James, you gotta change careers. So he did come back down and he filed a claim. And then he went to California and worked in the peach orchards for $35 a month. And he saved up his money, and in about 1868, 1869, Arthur returned to Canada, collected the wife and 5 children, and rode the train to Bismarck. And then from Bismarck to the homestead site, they had a team and wagon, but they had it so full of stuff that they had to walk. The youngest child being Jenny, and she was only 3 years old. And it took them 9 days. So can you imagine dragging 5 kids walking that far? It had to be fun, and Archie had to be the uncle of the year. James and Celestine, like I said, had 11 children. Felix, and he married Elzia Hickey, and they moved eventually to Woodland, California. And there's an ambulance call. Yeah, over. Maud, Angeline, she married Jacob T. Kepler. Rosanna, or Rose, married Joseph Hickey. They was a carpenter in California. Matilda Tilly, she married Charles Dalkenberger. He was a photographer by trade when they first married, but they ended up in Belle Fourche running the Gem Cafe for a number of years. I think like 35. And then Jenny, she was age 3 when they came here. She married Robert Packer, and they ended up being, I brought a map. They homesteaded or had their place right at the top of Cedar Canyon, very close to where the Bismarck Trail comes through that area. Mr. Packer was part of the Lemon Cowboys, the big ranch up there. Fred married Delia. Then we have Navarre and Wade and Lon and Yvonne. They had a child named Mary, and died at 11 years old. Alphonse married Belle Sealers. They had the Independent Oil Company, Jack. Frank married Mary Victoria Ginkolo. Is that how you say it? And they lived on the Belle Fourche River. Talk about that a little bit. Elmer and Sophia Anna Lanoit. They had the Bear Butte shop for a while. Cecilia married John Malone. He was a phone operator, or she was a phone operator. They met in the Philippines, and then they later settled in California also. I go into a few more things here later on. I just want to go over some of this. Mike and Mary were married, Mike and Mary were, she was 16 when they were married. They had 10 kids. Mike came to the area, I don't know why, but he walked from the Great Lakes region, so he would have come from Quebec down through the Great Lakes somehow. I'm guessing he was milking cows for somebody coming out here on the wagon train. He was only 11 years old. So he was working for people on the wagon train. There's a lot of milk cows that were walked out here from Wisconsin, and they had to be milked twice a day as they drove them out. So I have a feeling that's what Mike did, purely guessing. Mike and James both worked at the blacksmith shop in Deadwood, and I did find, when Deadwood burned in 1879, it destroyed a lot of their records, but I was able to find them up there in 1874 and 1875. Some books say it was making harness, some say it's blacksmithing. I'm sure the shop was one stop, so that's where they were doing, and he was a very young man up there taking on those chores. Mike and Mary, like I said, had 10 kids. First baby boy, they lost him. Mary was only 16. Next was Joseph, my grandfather, and he married Marie Lorraine. They had Earl and Camilla. Albert was drafted into World War I, and the flu epidemic hit when he was in the drafting part. He went down and was at Fort Omaha, I believe, and the flu epidemic actually killed him in 1918. Lena was a spinster, and she did lots of stuff. She had funerals in her home. She claimed ground and helped the boys claim it up. Kept a lot of the kids for school. She did funerals in her house. She catered food. And she was always busy. The one thing I did hear about her, and I do have a picture of him, is she fell in love with a soldier from Fort Meade. And when he went out and asked her father for permission to marry her, he denied it, and it broke her heart. Agnes was a spinster her entire life, but she was the housekeeper for Father Keffler for 31 years, and he resided in Iowa. He was a great uncle to them. Claire and Earl Minter, he was a sheriff, and that's Pat and Robert and Marjorie Minter. Teresa married Cloyce Smith. They ended up in Minville, Oregon. Toledo, Ohio, they formed the Archway Cookie Company, and you can still find Archway cookies occasionally. I have no idea if it's still in the family, I doubt it. Edward, or Ed, married Ann Krasinski. They had Patsy Bruce and Marilyn. Gertrude married Louis Jr. II Cheney, and they had Louis Jr. III. Dolores and Dorothy were twins. Paul, Joan, Marlis, and at the very end, like me, was Connie Joe. Andrew Germani was an Egger, and they had Martin and Dr. Donald Bachand. After this family had some bad hardships. My grandfather died young, and like I started to say, I think he had some genetic problems. Albert was killed in the war. Ed died tragically New Year's Eve 1940. They got a flat tire on their car, and he went to change it and slumped over. His wife was able to get him in the car, and they got him to his mom's house, and he died several hours later. So she went from having 4 sons to 1, and that was tough on her. And the girls, like I said, they did pretty good. They lasted. The other brother, Arthur, after he got done playing Uncle of the Year, in 1897 he went to Clyde, Kansas to visit his sister. Down there he met a young lady by the name of Ida Coe, And I don't know, she also had another name, so if she was married beforehand, I don't know, but Bovin is another name that you will find on her. They were actually married in Kansas, and then they came up here and they had a big to-do for them too. Archie and Ida did not have any children, but they raised kids. Grandma Mary got typhoid fever, and in the book, the history book, it just says Teresa was taken. She was only 3 months old. Now, my cousins that I was able to talk to said it was three children. When they were taken from the home where they were taken, it was only probably quarter mile, half mile, but they were never to return back to the original home. Their mother was considered dead in their eyes. And that's kind of how the cousin told me about it. So it would have been Agnes, Clara, and Teresa. And they were kept for a year by Arthur and Ida. Meanwhile, my grandmother was recuperating. I gotta make sure I get the right one. Jenny come down and stayed with the family and recuperated my grandmother, took care of the house, cooked, cleaned, did everything. She was there for almost 3 months, and Archie and Ida kept the kids for a year. Also, they raised to adulthood Marianne and Cleo Tremblay. They were nieces and nephews from Kansas, and their parents had been killed. And then they also raised Dulita Beamar and Johnny Elmer. Little tidbit from Maryland, she stated they called her Old Aunt Ivy. She made bread and butter and sugar sandwiches, which we loved, and her mother didn't think that was very good because it might give them worms. Now kind of back to the Malikses. Like I said, they had 12 kids that came from Canada, went to Connecticut, New Hampshire, Clyde, Kansas. Joe and Louis came in 1890 and settled on the bench. Joseph Napoleon Malix Dooney married Bernice Ruth Castile, 918. Homesteaded straight north of their uncles. The Bin or Kenny Bike House when I was little is the area. I can remember going over there, and Kenny was a big man in my eyes, and his wife was a little short. Their daughter Melissa and I were the same age, and 4-H club. We were out back their house playing, and I ran over by their clothesline, and I ran over a ground hornet nest, and they flew up into my shirt. I cannot tell you how miserable I was. They really stung me, but that's how I remember that house. And we watched spooky movies, and that house was spooky anyways. But
my wife was still short. She never grew up.
I see. Well, they're here, and I didn't even know it. The way they settled, I think we got that slide later on, right? But on Spring Creek, and I have a picture of it up here, when they first came in, they actually settled on the creek. The divots are still there. Wade and I went and found them. The well site is still there. It's kind of, they settled in a curve. They just took the advantage of the natural curve of the creek and settled there. Mike was just down the creek. And I think they probably got flooded out from some of the floods I witnessed on that creek while I lived there. And they moved back about 3/4 of a mile probably. But they put a little hill between them. And Connie Joe said they sledded a lot on it. But it avoided you seeing what each other was doing. But, so it was James. Mike was on the back. And then the road that you went to Mike's house, when you went farther up, it was Archie's. And that still remains in Wade's possession. And then when you went to the end of the road, that was the bench. I don't know, I talked to Malix's why it got that name, but it was the bench, and the Malix's took it over. But there were several of them that settled in there. They were good Catholics and had a lot of kids. But that was, at one time, in some of the stuff I read, and we don't know where it was, but there was a Malix school, and 13 out of the 14 kids in it were Malix's. So, we're not real sure where it was, but I'm guessing it was on the bench. My Aunt Camilla married Sandra and Berlotto. They had 6 kids, Louis, David, Deanne, Eugene, Sandra, and Bob. Sandy worked at Homestake, and Aunt Camilla was a nurse, a registered nurse at Fort Meade. My mom and dad married Wilda Oliver, Kenny, Ann, Erlene, Penny, and me. And I'm an afterthought like Connie Joe. I didn't even make the history books. So I'm like, wait, there's one more. One thing I will say, and I'm afraid to admit it, but my dad used to squeeze my arm. I was kind of heftier, brutal then, but he'd be like, you're fluffy. And I was like, is that a nice way of saying I'm fat? He goes, no, you're fluffy like grandma. And I was always assuming he meant my grandma, and I'm like, that little lady could have weighed 80 pounds. But he was referring to Grandma Keffler. Okay. Oh, there's the picture I needed. So, it's kind of self-explanatory. That little nook down in there is the homestead site. This is looking south. This picture was taken from Wade Bachand's yard at Spring Creek. This is where the original homestead site was. Now this is James. They moved back to the current location. I'm sure spring flood caused trouble at where they were. The Bismarck Trail brought them to the area. The trail is north about 3 miles. Actually, it's kind of right up by Gary's now house, right? Yeah. All 3 brothers staked claims together. This is James's site. Michael was just to the east, Archie to the north, like I told you about. As of I write this in 1022, the original sites are still in the Bachand family, but still true today. Spring Creek is deceiving. It notoriously goes dry. But that big hill, we had a really wet summer and spring. And it slid, literally slid. And all of a sudden, it had cattails growing up in it. So at one time, there was a very good spring there. Whether it went deeper, or somebody tapped into it, or whatever, who knows. That ridge right there are some pretty good cliffs. Took a horse down one bucking one day, that didn't work very good. Martin said, and if anybody knew Martin, it may be a story, but the Indians supposedly did little buffalo jump-offs there, and they very well could have, because it's very flat on top and just drops. And it's very rocky. Next. This is a picture provided by Marilyn Nona. This is the old home place on Spring Creek. Lena, Dad, Mom with Eddie, Agnes in the chair, Clara sitting on the porch, Teresa and Albert standing. Just showing some of the sites. Go ahead. This one's the old house too. This is when the Cheneys were in it, 1943. This is Mike Bachand. So if you look through that house, this would be facing to the west. If you look through it and over the hill, then there was James. Go ahead. There's some newspaper clippings and Martin showing the old barn and the original house.
Their original house was our granary when I lived there.
Oh, really? Okay. Next. This is Rose Mallow. She's the sister to James and Mike. I'm kind of hopeful this lady in the back picture was their mother. It's the only picture I have, or if it was her as a younger woman. One of her boys came out here in like 1963 or something and visited, but she was the last descendant of the ones that came from Canada. She was like 102 when she passed away. Next. Here's a big family get together. I don't know everybody in that picture. We have the back side of that one? Probably not. But it's just, they did a lot of picnics, a lot of get-togethers, a lot of gatherings. This is Andrew. There's Gramani. There's Lena's house here in Sturgis. That was made by a Keffler, a brother to Mary. And in her later years, Mary came in and lived with Lena, or Lena lived with Mary, I don't know which, but that house was made by the Keffler brothers. And I think there's, might be like 2 or 3 of them in a row there that they made. Lena had that house for a long time. She took in school kids so they could come to school and town, like I said. And when you walked in, when Jenny had this house, you walked in and it was kind of set up because she had some funerals or viewings in her house, or wakes, I don't know which. But when you walked in, there was room for the casket, and then you went in and they'd kind of set it up circular, and the kitchen was kind of off by itself, and she had like a dumbwaiter type area where she could serve food to the people visiting. Mike, when he was helping Jenny, now when I refer to Mike, there's 2 Mikes that are still living. One's the descendant of James, and one's the descendant of Michael Bachand. But when they were remodeling this house, they actually found Lena's well in the backyard. This is a very old picture with St. Martin's Academy on top there, and it just goes to show that the Keffler, Mary was one of the first people to receive communion, I guess. It's a very old shot of Sturgis. Here's that picture again of the Bullock, or the Keffler store, and that was just a postcard and season's greetings of some of the stuff in town. This is Mary. Okay. Grandma Mary had her health problems too. In this picture, she's had a really bad stroke, and it was a stroke that killed her, but she's holding her arm there, you can see. She also developed breast cancer and had to go to Hot Springs, and they had that removed, and you can kind of see that in that picture. This is at Lena's house in town. Next. Here's my mom and dad when they were quite young. Here's another big family picnic. Are you in there?
Probably. I can see Marlis and their Dolores. Let me take pictures.
This is my mom and dad. This is Eileen, Bachand. There's Martin. There's Vernon.
Is it Camilla in the lower right?
Yep, there's Camilla and some of the kids.
Mother's in the striped.
This is Edward, right, or Frank?
Mother's in the dress with the black and white stripes.
Here?
Yeah, that's mother.
Okay.
And Daddy's behind the lady in the pink dress or white dress.
A lot of the kids are in that picture. My 2 older siblings are in there.
Where?
There.
Oh, sure enough.
Where were you?
Am I in front of Ann? Is that me, the blonde?
I don't think so.
Now next to your dad looks like Kurt or Jake or Morris Keffler, or maybe he's a Keffler. And then next to that is Dawn Donahue. In front of him on her knees is Dolores.
Yeah.
And then in front of Dolores is Evelyn Bachand maybe. And then Jane or Joanne Keffler.
But anyway, that's just a big family picture at the Sturgis Park, I think, 1953. And I'm running way over schedule, so next.
Oh, I was in the pigtails at the end.
This is the story about our barn burnt down when I was a little kid. There was always an extra foundation around one side of our barn, and my dad said, well, this place burnt down once. This is the story of that. Fires were very real back then. It was no laughing matter. This one started at the Hopkins Ranch in Bearby Valley and continued to burn to the Cheyenne River. So it took up a big amount of real estate. We lived on the Wells place, or that was one of the people that had it before us, and like I said, it burned the barn down, they rebuilt it, but part of the foundation was still the old one. Another story that my mom told me is they lived at Plainview and there was a huge, huge fire, and Grandpa took the car. Well, there's Grandma with 5 kids and nowhere to go. So she took them down to the creek with some old blankets and she threw them into one of them nasty holes that develop when it's dry. And they literally had to jump off the creek bank in there. And Mom said, we sank so far in the mud, I knew I was stuck forever. But she threw the little blankets down, told them to wet it and put them over it. Well, one time, and she doesn't know and I don't know where Grandma went. But the fire burned over them, or around them. Grandma came and got them after the fact. And Mom always said there was so much of that nasty black mud and they stunk and there was leeches all over them, and she goes, we couldn't get out of that hole, it was terrifying. But that just gives you an idea. I mean, they had nowhere. If they didn't have a car or horses or something or somewhere to go, when something that big happened, it was devastating. So, next. There's been some tragedy within the Bachand family. Some of you probably remember this. Mary Kay was the daughter of Martin and Eileen. Extremely beautiful woman. Basically what happened is she had a stalker and he killed her. And it was a bad deal. That's just more on the story. All right. Here is, now this is facing to the north. This is Mike's homestead, that way. You just continue down and Archie was back there, and the Malixes were on the bench back there. Again, here's the road going to the home place. This is going west. This is Mike's. This is that little hill I'm talking about. It wasn't much, but it divided the families, I guess. But
Still there today.
yeah, it's still there today. What an excellent view. And then this one over here, this is from James's or Wade's yard. Keffler's were over there. But I have seen many a great sunset on that place there with Bear Butte. And the next. It's just kind of a misery picture. Some of the stores that were involved in our family, that, like I said before, the Keffler dry goods store, Jake Keffler, Dominic Keffler had the first feed store in Sturgis, had the Ruth Hotel. Anna Keffler married Henry Ruth and operated it. Their daughters married Tribbies, Hales, and Shermans. The building ended up, I believe, owned by the Bachands and Brooks for a while. The Haight Brink Fruth Saloon, Peter Lorang moved barrels from the railhead to the saloons in Fort Meade. Carls's were also in the valley with us. They sold cheese to W.E. Adams in Deadwood. All families sold beef, hogs to Keller Butcher Shop in Deadwood. There was a Bear Butte Tavern owned by Bob Magnus. In 1928, the Carlses set up their own cream station, general store, and the post office at Bear Butte. And they sold cream to the Fairmont Milk Company, which would come and pick it up. John Scheibel had a blacksmith shop in Bear Butte. And he remained there until basically, nobody needed his services anymore, and that kind of came with the introduction of the steam tractors and whatnot. But then it became the Valley Implement and Case Farm Dealery, the Bear Butte Shop, Elmer Bachand. There was Matkins Motors in Sturgis. I remember Kip and Linda being out in the valley. The different stores, Matilda and Jenny worked in the old commercial hotel for $20 a month. They had no days off. She later married Charles, who had the photo studio owned by and operated, and then they operated the Gem Cafe in Belfouche until 1936. The gas station or old Senex site, Alphonse Bachand and the Independent Oil Company. Multiple threshing crews. There's at least 2 owned by the Bachands. Edward had one out on the river. Wade's family ran one. Keffler's had at least 2, I think. And they kind of stationed themselves, like the Bachands went around and through the Belfouche River. I know, and I've talked to Malix's, they talked about that. Keffler's kind of were up on the Alkali Divide. Fred's kind of took care of the valley and Spring Creek area. What else? Like I said, there were 11 saloons in Sturgis at one time, so it was pretty merry in Sturgis.
That's a change.
Yeah. Schools that a lot of the children went to were Lower Bear Butte School, the Volunteer School, District 52, the Malix School, although we're not real sure where that was, or if it got renamed, the Wilson School, the Bigsby School, and then St. Martin's Academy here in Sturgis. Frank had teachers hired, mainly because of the river. The Belfouche River was not dammed and could get very large and be basically a pain. They would be trapped on the east side of the river and couldn't make it to town, couldn't come to family functions, couldn't make it to church, which was a big deal back then. The Bachands were mostly Catholic. Jenny Bachand, like I said, had a daughter, Edith. She joined the sisterhood and became Sister Winifred. Father Keffler was a priest. He did come out here for family functions and weddings and funerals and helped preside over them. Mary Keffler was the first for First Communion and Confirmation at St. Martin's. The people were members of the Altar Society, Knights of Columbus, American Legion, Degree of Honor, Meade County Flower Mothers, Moose, Elks, Extension Clubs, 4-H leaders, and commissioners. They enjoyed dances. Ed Carls, Fred Bachand, George Steen, Eric By, Dominic Schumer, Albert Keffler. They all had big barns and they all danced. The Bear Butte Tavern, the Vale Community Hall, the Alkali Hall, all areas where they went and played cards, bridge and whisk and etc. Baseball was a big deal. Basketball a little bit later on. Alkali Polo Club, there again, the horses, they went and played. Leo Keffler had an accordion, Winford Martin, Bob Elliott, Alkali Bob played violins. Keffler boys, as they grew up, learned to play the violin. They played dances, nonstop, all the time. They last played at the Golden Slipper in Lead, owned by Dave Keffler in 1934. Health here again is just, it was Matilda Tilley who came down for 3 months and nursed Mary Keffler back to health. There was J.B. Napsker, Dr. Pratt, the Hot Springs Hospital, later Deadwood, St. Joe's and Rapid City. But the real saviors of the world were probably the midwives of the community. Mary J. Barnes, Mrs. Hayes on Willard Street, Mary Ann Hall, Grandma Hall, and Linda Lundgren, Mother Lundgren. They were all brought at a call. Diseases, there's so many of them that we've conquered. Diphtheria, rheumatic fever, rubella, measles, mumps, smallpox. 1917, flu epidemic, typhoid fever. Some of the storms, 1911 was very dry, 1907 was a terrible, terrible blizzard. That blizzard hit with intensity, and it hit when the school children were walking back and forth from their homes. And even up in our area, there were several children that froze to death before they ever got home. 1886-87, severe blizzard, high cattle losses. 11 feet fell starting October 15th, and it didn't thaw till April. 1883, the black diphtheria epidemic. January 12th, 1880, king of all Texas blizzards. It was from Canada to Texas. 1879, Deadwood burned. 1941 was a fast-moving blizzard. 73 people died in that. And the winters of 48 and 49 were bad. I have a little story about that for my dad, but we can do that some other day. Like I said, the Bachands and the Keflers intermarried 3 times. All I know is my dad said when I got to an age, you will not date a Kefler. Okay. That name was off the books. And that's kind of the end of my session. Anybody got any questions? I do have some lot of old pictures up here. There's 2 or 3 of them. They are of Rapid City. I went to an auction, I can't even tell you who it was, in about 2000, and they were selling prints. And some of them were tin slides and whatnot. And this one I have of the World Fair, the original tin and print sold for $10,000. That's exactly what I did in the crowd one. A lot of what I got is the plates are smeared, or the proofs were smeared. But yeah, I had to work a lot of Sundays to get them all paid for. But they're very cool. Some of them is Pennington County Fair. There's different pictures up here. I have a book of the Bismarck Trail, kind of the history. I'm kind of into that now. It's very, very weird to drive team and wagon over your forefathers' trail. It's cool. I have some old maps over there. That one over there has some of the newer generations, but it kind of gives you a layout where stuff was. The bench, I don't know, Malix's, it was just the bench. And I think geographically, it's flat and drops off the north side, right? The one and only fire I went to over there, I thought I dropped off the edge of the world. They did put a missile silo base right over there, kind of hit it right there, back in the day of the Cold War. The black book over there just has some family things of what they were involved in, fairs and family events, and I got drugged to more card parties and extension club, and it was good for me, I know, but dances, kids always went. Coats were all thrown in the corner. Got to be a certain time, every single kid was in the pile.
Sleep.
Yep, went to sleep, and you danced with your parents usually. Card parties, us kids played till we were just wore out, same thing. All the coats were in a pile, kids lived in a coat pile. I still don't know how to play whist or any of them games, but. The middle book over there, it has quite a few obituaries and clippings and whatnot I've got from multiple cousins. Anybody else got any questions?
Julie, I have Society of Black Hills Pioneer, if they're one.
Oh, yes, I mentioned that before. Black Hills Pioneer, Chris Maupin, she used to be a Kinghorn. longtime family friends, but she is the secretary of the organization. If any of you cousins want to get into that, I've already proved Michael was one. James, I think I have that paperwork. I mean, he was also a pioneer, but any of you are allowed to sign up to that. Like I said, they're a cool organization. They do a lot of stuff with the history. Those Bismarck Trail markers were put up by them at one time, and they do a lot for the cemeteries. And they meet and do family histories and stuff, so. Anybody else?
Julia, I think that Bailey School was just a mile north of the house. It would have been on the next section line right on the corner. I remember it when I was 5, 6 years old, and then the building went away, so I don't know. But I didn't know what it was called.
It, like I said, the one mention I believe you, a lot of schools got moved. They were turned into houses, they were turned into granaries, they were made into additions. That was the other thing, the Keflers and I think the Bachands had a little hand in that also, but the Brooks. When Fort Meade kind of dismantled some of their buildings, they all took them down, they moved them into town, they made houses with them, they did things with them. Shacks, houses were moved, so yeah, I'm okay. Like I said, it's the one deal I read, that 13 out of the 14 pupils were Malixes, so I'm sure they put it right up there on the bench because they were all there. The one story I read, I think they walked 3 miles, which, not bad.
It's uphill both ways.
The bench was flat, don't give me that.
I think that's what it was. We had the valley, and the bench was the flat. It's
And
like
the valley schools, the school my older siblings went to, the upper end, where Bear Butte was, there was a school there for a little bit. And then it actually got moved farther to the west. And the one at Bear Butte burned down like on Valentine's Day, and they made some comment about being a hot Valentine's box or something. I don't know, the school kids made a big deal about it. But then, yeah, then they were at the volunteer school. My older siblings went there. I got the bus ride for an hour and a half to Sturgis. But any other questions or comments?
I remember Dad telling about Grandpa when he had the place down on the river, you were talking about Frank keeping the teachers. I think that there used to be an old schoolhouse, basically in Frank's area there, and it was across the river. And at that time, the teacher was staying with Grandpa, and she would have to cross the river to teach the school every day. And she had a young child, and so she would take the child with her. And Grandpa said that they had an ice jam that came down, and he told her she wanted to just go to school, and he told her not to go there, but she and that child crossed the ice jam safely, and then an hour later it went out. So, yeah.
Speaking of that, ice outs in the spring were dangerous, just as Wade talked. When I was in the younger grades, the Belfouche jammed. It was that curve right before you went down to Ralph's house. It was plugged right there, or jammed up. And the National Guard came out and dropped dynamite in there and blew it up. That was a wave of water. Of course, back then we had radio, so KBHB was telling everybody downstream. But I can remember Martin calling Dad one time about Bear Butte. And he said, things are jammed up here and I think it's gonna break. And we ran outside and you could hear it, just the crack. And then when it went, you could hear the trees, just the huge 4-foot trees that it was taking out. And I remember, like on the Belfouche, most of them big cottonwoods were scarred from where the ice hit them. Usually you could see it, and that's something you don't really see anymore, but the big cottonwoods would be scarred on the ways out. You could see the scars where the icebergs hit them. I'm sure they had fun on the river. One of the, That was the other thing about the Bachands. Initially, they were very, very diversified. They had sheep, they had cattle, they had milk cows, they had chickens, whatever they needed. And James' foresight into what the community as a whole probably needed really set the family up. Because they sold to the Deadwood. I mean, you realize they needed to have something to eat. They needed to have fiber from the sheep for clothes. Like I told that other story, they had geese. That went into the mattress for ticking, the pillows, that type stuff, you know. So large herds of those type of critters could be used and utilized. Let me get my cards. And nobody wants to run off on me. The ranches and the cattle were huge. And mainly that was because of the reservation. It was open ground as far as grazing, they hadn't shut it down yet. Cattle, livestock, like I said, cattle, hogs, chickens, sheep, and bees, and pigs. I'll tell you a story about pigs. 1930s, the dirty 30s, that hit the Bachands hard. If we had moldy money, we lost most of it then. Anthrax struck then because it was so dry, and the cattle herds were hit terrible hard. Some of the ranches that were in the river area was the Cross S, the Flying V, the AV Cattle Company. They ran from the Cheyenne River to the reservation. The 3 V's, that was around up in 1908 Cattle Company. The Flying V, Shadley Cattle Company, and the 1902 Cowboys. They ran from the Short Pines to the Cheyenne Reservation, pretty much from the Morrow River to the Grand River. They ran at that time between 50 and 75,000 head of cattle. The Cowboys at that time, and this would be frank, would make $35 to $45 a month in pay, depending on how good they were and what their rank was. The saving grace to many women in the area was 1943, when REA brought the electricity to the valley and they could have power. Pigs. I made this mistake one time asking my dad if we could get some pigs. My dad didn't get real irate, but yeah, he came on court. He's like, no uncertain way, and are we getting pigs? I was like, okay. But the blizzard of 49, I'll tell a short story on that. It happened on New Year's Eve. It caught a lot of people unaware. They had a very open, warm winter, and when it hit hard. Dad said when it was over in their house, they had one of those little square offset windows in the attic. And that's what he crawled out of and walked out on top of the snow. And they got out to their barn. And of course, they had one of the big hay doors on it, like the old hip roofs did. And he said, you know, I was just a wee boy. And I said, oh. And he said, I fit through there and fell to the floor, and it was full of hay, of course. And he said, on my way out there, he said, I found it strange. And I said, what do you mean? He's like, it was so silent. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, there was nothing. There's no sound. So he got to the barn, fell in there, and he fed the teams, and the milk cow happened to be in there. And he said, I got a shovel. He said, I worked my way back out of the barn. And he said, I went over into the snowdrift where I thought the hog barn should be. I said, oh. And back in those days, I don't know if most of you know what they were, but they were just a slanted roof building, flat faced, and they had windows in the front to help with heat. And he said I had to dig almost 10 feet until I got to the roof. He goes, I got to the edge and kept digging, and I got down and got a window out, and he had strawed the pigs. And he said, I popped that window out, and he said, I thought they were all dead. Now that's how they made their money. Those they weren't gonna eat if the pigs had died. So he said, I popped that window out and I had to look for a long time. He said, all of a sudden, puff of air, puff of air, puff of air. He's like, the pigs had burrowed under the straw and they were alive, and I got the window open so they get fresh air. One of the other stories that they talk about is Edward and Frank bringing pigs in, and they had to bring them by wagon, and they drove at night to keep the pigs cool. I can't imagine having pigs in a wagon, because if you've ever tried to get a saddle horse next to pigs, they think they're gonna die. It might have been some exciting rides. The wagons they used had to be either like those hay wagons, or they had to have crates on them somehow, I'm not sure, but they'd bring them to town, bring them to Deadwood for food. I asked my dad if they ever ate anything off a pig, and he said no. In the dirty 30s, Dad did a lot of trapping and ate some stuff I probably won't try. Beaver, coon, literally sparrows off the line. I mean, it was a hard times. Rabbits. What are you telling me about? Anyway, hard times. But they loved, played. It was fun. What stories you telling? No stories. They're both sitting there giggling. But any other questions? I went way over my limit.
You did. You still have 5 days left.
5 days.
Yeah, I got 5 days left.
But anyway, that's my story, I guess.
I guess that's all we have. Like I said, we got the programs coming up in
Thank you, guys.
next 2 months, March, I think it's spring, in October. We take December off, so we always like to, we couldn't do these programs without our presenters have a little token for you. It's not much, but might pay for a little bit of the gas trip out here, but
Thank you.
at any rate, because that's all I have. Thanks for coming. This was good.
Thank you.